and that the monetary authority couldn't really control inflation. It was fiscal policy and some other things that were more important. And he was making a case that monetary policy could control inflation, and inflation was always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, which is the great quote from Friedman. And at the time, I was reading the stuff and saying, yeah, this makes a lot of sense to me. He's really, and all of my friends and colleagues were thinking I was a cuckoo. So I was the resident cuckoo at Arizona State for becoming a kind of a Friedmanite at a very early age. So what I've done is I was asked to talk about Friedman's impact on monetary policy. So what I've chosen to do is I'm going to talk about a lesson learned, well, sort of learned, and then I'm going to talk about a lesson that's not learned, and I think there are at least two. There are probably more, but at least two that I can think of that were not learned. I'm only going to talk about one of the two. And then I'm going to talk about the unintended consequences of kind of learning the first one and not learning the second one. All right, so that's kind of what my story is going to be. So the first lesson is based on the principle that Friedman had, which is that, as I've already said, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, and its corollary, which is that central banks could control inflation. All right? Friedman was making these arguments through the 60s and early 70s, and basically not winning the debate is the way I would call it. But we had the very rapid inflation in the 70s, for those of you in the room who are old enough, and many of you are, to remember that. And then we had a chairman of the Federal Reserve who was remarkable, actually, by the name of Paul Volcker, who, when inflation got very, very high, really took charge and decided he was going to take steps to bring inflation down. Now, I really admire Volcker for that, but the truth is he didn't have a choice. He had to try to do something. Inflation was double-digit, it was unacceptably high, and he really had his back up against the wall, so to speak. Well, that experiment, as we know, worked. Inflation came down rather dramatically, and that convinced all the central banks around the world, basically, that monetary policy could, in fact, control the long-run rate of inflation in the economy. And so what do we have? Well, we have probably nearly every central bank in the world is either explicitly, many are explicitly, or implicitly, as in the case in the Federal Reserve, inflation targeters. So they all believe they can control inflation, and it's the dominant thing. So they did learn that lesson. However, Milton Friedman argued that you controlled inflation by controlling the money supply. It was linked to money supply, right? So, and he was advocating at the time in the late, in the 60s and late in the 70s, most central banks were operating on kind of what we call interest rate targeting. They were more concerned about interest rates than they were about monetary aggregates. And what do we have today? Well, we have every central bank in the world essentially targeting interest rates and paying almost no attention at all to monetary aggregates. So that's why I say it's a lesson that was, well, it was kind of learned. It was learned, but in some sense, maybe a main point of the lesson was still missed. So what was the lesson that was not learned? Well, Friedman was very, very skeptical of the ability of the central bank to affect the real economy, right? So if the economy was in recession, Friedman was very skeptical of monetary policy having significant real effects on the economy, right? And he argued that skepticism went in spades when he talked about fiscal policy. So he was very skeptical about either monetary or fiscal policy having any significant real effects, and in particular trying to fine-tune the economy using monetary and fiscal policy. The corollary to that was that attempting to do so could be dangerous right? So if you try to stabilize the economy by trying to do something that you cannot do, right, you might actually cause the economy to become less stable, not more stable, right? So we have a lesson that was kind of learned in that most central banks now believe they can, in fact, control inflation. But nobody pays really any attention to monetary aggregates or to the balance sheets of central banks. We have the lesson that was not learned, which is maybe monetary policy can't really do too much to affect the economy. And now we have the unintended consequence. All right, so what's the unintended consequence? Well, the unintended consequence is that most central banks are, in fact, either implicitly or explicitly targeting inflation, right? And they set an inflation objective, and as long as everybody kind of knows what the inflation objective is, and they really believe that the central bank can, in fact, achieve the objective, then expectations kind of anchor the inflation rate. So the inflation rate turns out to be a lot more stable, right, than it would otherwise be because the markets revealed transparency, or the central banks have revealed what their inflation target is. As long as the market believes that the central bank can achieve that objective, and we had a demonstration, that was a very powerful demonstration in the US in the late 70s and early 80s, that we could do that, then what happens is you get inflation expectations that are anchored, right? So then what do? Well, inflation expectations are anchored, then you try to do what? You try to do more than you can do. All right, so I'm going to give you a couple examples. In response to the 2001 recession, the Federal Market Committee reduced the funds rate target. It targets something called the federal funds rate, which is an overnight rate, interbank rate that banks lend money to themselves in an overnight market. And they have a target for that. They reduced that from 6.5%, which it was in January 1 of 2001, to 1%, right, by June of 2003, right? 1% was then historically low, but of course the target now is what? Anybody know? Essentially zero, right? So we did better than 1%, we've gone to zero. So basically, and one other thing is I said, well, importantly, the rate was below 5.5% from April of 01 through February 6th, to February of 06. That's a period of 4 years and 9 months. So 4 years and 9 months, it was below 4.5%. You're going, who cares, 4.5%? What's 4.5%, right? Well, a nominal interest rate has two components. It has a real component, which is the real rate of return, and it has an inflation expectations component, which is the component that reflects the rate of increase in the rate of depreciation in the value of the dollar over time. So if inflation expectations, if the inflation target of the Federal Reserve is, let's say, 2%, which it's widely believed that it is, and if the real rate of interest is, let's say, about 2.5%, because kind of that's average growth rate, a little less than the average growth rate of real GDP, then 4.5% says, well, that's kind of where you'd want to be in a kind of a steady state, right? So anything below that would be kind of an easy monetary policy, right? If you think of it in terms of interest rates, anything above it. So we kept monetary policy very easy for over 4 years, almost 5 years, right? And in fact, if you think about how low we were below 4.5%, we all went all the way to 1%, policy was extraordinarily easy if measured it by that metric, right, over the time. Well, why did we do that? Well, the 2001 recession was very mild. In fact, I didn't go look at historical data, but if you pull up the revised data, revised GDP, you can't hardly see the sucker, right? It's hardly not there, right? So basically, GDP had completely recovered, right, in 2001 by essentially almost the end of the year, beginning of 2002. It had completely recovered, right? So why did we keep the funds rate below some reasonable measure of a long-run equilibrium interest rate for another almost 5 years, or 4 years? And the answer was employment growth. Employment wasn't doing anything. In fact, employment, in the 2001 recession, employment was still falling. Not like today, it's actually turned around. It was still falling this past the recession, way past the recession. So what was monetary policy doing? It was trying to, right, increase employment growth. Well, I think that a lot of people would agree that monetary policy is probably particularly poorly suited for having any impact on employment. So what were we doing? Well, we were trying to do something we couldn't do because we had inflation expectations anchored, right? And in fact, if you read, which are now available online, by the way, the 2003 and 2004 transcripts of Federal Market Committee meetings, you will find that that's exactly what we were doing. In fact, Greenspan, who was chairman at the time, basically said, normally we'd be raising the rate right now, but as long as inflation expectations are anchored, we're not going to do anything. All right, so what was the unintended consequence? Well, one unintended consequence might have been it exacerbated the financial crisis. John Taylor and others argue that, and I've exchanged emails with John, I don't agree 100% with him, but I think there's some truth to it. John would argue that keeping the funds rate at 1%, which we did for an entire year, and keeping it well below an equilibrium for a long period of time, right, provided fuel for the housing market. I pointed out to John that mortgage rates really didn't go down, right? And then he pointed out to me that, well, the ARMs did. And it's true that the ARMs did fall. So there is some truth to the idea that certainly having that low could have exacerbated, I don't think it's the total culprit, but it could have exacerbated the growth in the housing industry and the subsequent, the housing bubble and the subsequent collapse of that bubble. All right. I would argue that whether it did or not, it's just not a reasonable monetary policy to pursue. All right, the second example is where we are now. All right, in response to the financial recession, we reduced the target from what it was at before the recession, which was 5.25%, 5.25%, to zero from September of 2007 to October of 2008. So we very aggressively reduced the target. In fact, the last changes in the target we basically had to make, but that's another story. And we've committed to basically say what? We're going to keep the funds rate at zero for the language in the directive is for an extended period. All right? When we talk about it euphemistically around the shop, we say, for as far as the eye can see. All right, for some extended period, all right. And if you look at the, which I just did, blue chip today, it looks like they're thinking it somewhere around 2013 we'll start raising the target for the funds rate. So if you believe that, so we're going to keep it at historically low levels. And the point is, we've already been in below 4.5%. For 2 years, 7 months, and we could certainly outdo our previous record. Moreover, we're further below any idea of a long-run equilibrium rate than we've ever been historically, right? What's the unintended consequence of that? Well, we'll have to live and see what that might be.